The rise and fall of Briggs & Stratton, the engine that powered every American backyard. For 3 generations, a Saturday morning in suburban America had a sound. Not an alarm clock, not a radio, a pull cord, a sputter. Then that familiar low mechanical roar settling into a steady rhythm as it warmed up. That was the sound of Briggs & Stratton, and for most of the 20th century, it was the soundtrack of the American lawn. This is the story of how 2 men with $25,000 built the most dominant small-engine company in the world, and how, over a century later, that company filed for bankruptcy, undone by debt, disruption, and a world that stopped cutting grass the old way. In 1909, a young engineering graduate named Stephen Foster Briggs met a grain merchant named Harold M. Stratton. Briggs had an idea, a 6-cylinder, 2-cycle engine he had designed while still a student at North Dakota State College. Stratton had capital and ambition. Together, they incorporated a company in Wisconsin with $25,000 and a plan to break into the automobile industry. It didn't go well at first. The 6-cylinder engine was too expensive to produce at scale. A brief attempt at assembling automobiles also collapsed, pushing the partners close to bankruptcy. Most companies don't survive that kind of double failure out of the gate. Briggs & Stratton did, because Briggs kept inventing. In 1910, Briggs received a patent for a new gas engine igniter, a mechanism that could fire an automobile engine with a single spark. It wasn't a sensation, but it opened a door. The company found its footing not as an engine maker, but as a maker of electrical components for the booming automobile industry. By 1920, Briggs & Stratton had become the largest producer of specialty lights, ignitions, regulators, and ignition switches in the United States. Sales approached $4 million. Their customers included Chevrolet, Ford, Dodge, Nash, Studebaker, and nearly every other major car maker of the era. They also tried other things: refrigerators, crystal radios, soap dispensers, candy display stands. None of it worked. But in 1924, they found another winner: automotive locks. A new die-cast lock cylinder outperformed every brass model on the market, and within 5 years, Briggs & Stratton controlled more than 75% of the automotive lock business in America. The company was becoming something unusual, a highly profitable supplier of unglamorous essential components that nobody thought much about until they needed them: the motor wheel and the road to small engines. In 1919, Briggs & Stratton acquired something called the A.O. Smith motor wheel, a small gasoline engine mounted on a bicycle wheel that converted an ordinary bicycle into a crude motorized vehicle. It got roughly 100 miles per gallon and sold for about $90. The company had ambitious plans for it, marketing it across Asia and Latin America, even imagining it attached to rickshaws. Sales disappointed. They re-engineered it into America's first motor scooter. That didn't catch on either. But something unexpected happened. When they took the motor wheel's engine off the wheel and put it on a stationary mount, they had the foundation of an entirely different business. The stationary engine could power washing machines, garden equipment, compressors, and pumps. In 1923, the Model PB engine arrived. 2 years later, the Model F series followed. By 1931, Briggs & Stratton had a small, flat engine specifically designed to fit beneath washing machine tubs, and it became a bestseller. The washing machine market was their primary engine customer right up until World War II. When America entered the Second World War, Briggs & Stratton pivoted hard into military production. The company became one of the nation's 200 largest military suppliers, producing detonating fuses, artillery shells, ignition switches for aircraft, and engines for generators, pumps, ventilation systems, and field hospitals. Between 1938 and 1944, net income increased 6 times over, from under $800,000 to more than $6 million. The war made the company, but what came after the war made it legendary. Returning veterans came home and moved to the suburbs. Millions of new houses appeared on the American landscape, each with a yard. Each yard needed maintenance. The post-war suburban lawn became a cultural institution, a symbol of order, prosperity, and pride, and all of it needed to be mowed. Briggs & Stratton already made the best small gasoline engines in the country. They were perfectly positioned for what was about to happen. The company leaned in hard, redesigning its engines specifically for the new generation of lightweight rotary lawnmowers. In 1953, they introduced aluminum die-cast engines with chrome-plated pistons, lighter, more durable, and better suited to consumer outdoor equipment than anything that had come before. In 1954, they patented the die-cast technique, which quickly became the industry standard. Net sales more than doubled between 1953 and 1959, climbing from $40 million to $90 million. By 1965, annual sales exceeded $100 million for the first time. The Briggs Stratton name was now synonymous with the lawn mower. If you owned a mower in America, and by the 1960s most suburban households did, there was a very good chance a Briggs & Stratton engine sat beneath the hood. Their market share in small engines reached an almost incomprehensible 90%. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Briggs & Stratton ran its business with almost obsessive discipline. The company stuck to two things: small air-cooled gasoline engines and automobile components. No wild diversification, no chasing trends. Just a relentless focus on being the lowest cost, most reliable producer of the products it knew best. It worked extraordinarily well. Through the 1970s, net sales climbed from around $200 million to nearly $600 million. Among Fortune 500 companies, Briggs & Stratton ranked 405th in total sales, but 94th in profit margin and 44th in return on equity. For a company making lawnmower engines, those were remarkable numbers. But this kind of dominance creates its own vulnerabilities. When a company controls 90% of a market, it can become slow to see threats coming. It can mistake stability for permanence. And it can underestimate how quickly the world can change when a serious competitor decides it wants your market. In the early 1980s, Honda's motorcycle sales peaked. The Japanese automaker was looking for new markets. It turned its attention to outdoor power equipment and to the small engines that powered it. In 1984 alone, Honda spent $12.5 million advertising its lawn and garden products, representing a full 20% of the entire industry's advertising budget. Honda wasn't tiptoeing into this market. It was charging in with full force. Honda and other Japanese manufacturers, Kawasaki, Suzuki, Mitsubishi, had a significant advantage in this moment. A strong US dollar and a weak yen made their products cheaper for American equipment manufacturers to buy. Briggs & Stratton, which had long competed on low manufacturing costs, suddenly found its cost advantage shrinking. The company fought back. It introduced redesigned engine lines, doubled its research and engineering spending, and launched consumer advertising campaigns to protect its brand. It opened a highly automated, non-union engine plant in Kentucky, which required fewer workers and offered more manufacturing flexibility. It weathered a 3-month strike in 1983 to gain more operational flexibility in its Wisconsin plants. None of it delivered an immediate turnaround. By 1985, earnings had dropped 31% from their 1980 peak. Operating margins fell from nearly 14% to under 11%. The stock of ground Briggs & Stratton had held so comfortably for decades was now contested. In 1989, the company posted its first major financial loss in more than 50 years, a net drop of $20 million. For a company that had almost never failed, this was a profound shock. Briggs & Stratton responded with a long and painful restructuring. The most controversial move came in 1994, when the company announced it would relocate 2,000 jobs from its Wisconsin factories to new non-union plants in Georgia, Alabama, and Missouri. The southern states offered lower wages, tax incentives, and worker training programs. The wage differential was substantial. Workers in the new plants would earn roughly half what their Wisconsin counterparts made, adjusted for cost of living. The announcement hit Milwaukee hard. The union that represented Briggs & Stratton workers was furious. Company executives expressed regret, but said there was no alternative if the business was going to survive as a competitive manufacturer. Through the 1990s, the company also began shedding non-core assets. In 1995, it spun off its automotive security subsidiary, exiting the lock and key business it had dominated for 70 years. It sold its foundries, divested additional subsidiaries, and refocused entirely on engines and outdoor power equipment. Slowly, the restructuring worked. By the early 1990s, market share was recovering. The weakening of the US dollar relative to the Japanese yen restored some of Briggs & Stratton's cost competitiveness. Product development spending increased from 1.5% to 2.5% of sales. The company was leaner, meaner, and regaining its footing. As the decade closed, Briggs & Stratton remained the world's largest manufacturer of small gasoline engines. It had survived the Japanese challenge, the union battles, the losses, and the restructuring. It had adapted, cut costs, and fought its way back. But the world kept moving. Battery technology, once too heavy and too weak for demanding outdoor power tools, was improving rapidly. Companies like Ego, Greenworks, And eventually major players including Husqvarna and John Deere began offering battery-powered lawn equipment that was quieter, required less maintenance, and produced no direct emissions. Younger homeowners living in smaller spaces with smaller yards were willing to pay a premium to eliminate the gas can, the oil changes, and the pull cord frustration. Briggs Stratton was a gasoline engine company. That was its identity, its manufacturing capability, its entire reason for existing. Every shift toward electric and battery-powered equipment was a shift away from Briggs & Stratton's core business. The company also carried significant debt from years of acquisitions, including its purchase of outdoor power equipment brands. Instead of simply supplying engines to equipment makers, Briggs & Stratton had moved into making complete products: mowers, pressure washers, generators. It was a strategy meant to capture more of the value chain, but it also exposed the company to more risk, required more capital, and added complexity to a business that had once thrived on simplicity. Then, in the spring of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Normally, a surge in home improvement spending might have helped a company selling outdoor power equipment, but the pandemic also disrupted global supply chains. Manufacturing slowed, revenues fell, and Briggs & Stratton was carrying too much debt to absorb the shock. In July 2020, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The business that had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Japanese import challenge, and decades of labor conflict could not survive the combination of long-term structural decline and a short-term financial crisis. Briggs & Stratton's assets were acquired out of bankruptcy by KPS Capital Partners, a private equity firm, for a little over $550 million. The brand survived. Some of the manufacturing survived, but thousands of jobs, particularly in Wisconsin, did not. The Wauwatosa plant, the facility that had been the heart of Briggs & Stratton's engine production for most of the 20th century, faced a fundamentally different future than it once had. There is something worth sitting with in this story. Briggs & Stratton did not fail because it made bad products. Its engines were reliable, affordable, and everywhere. It did not fail because its people didn't work hard, or because its managers were reckless. By many measures, the company was a model of industrial discipline for most of its existence. It failed ultimately because the thing it was built to make, the small pull-start gasoline engine, stopped being the default answer to the question of how to power a lawnmower. Technology moved, consumer preferences shifted. The suburban Saturday morning ritual didn't disappear, but the sound that accompanied it began to change. The pull of a starter cord, the sputter, the low mechanical roar. For 100 years, that was Briggs & Stratton. Now the sound is different. A battery clicks in, a motor hums quietly to life, and another chapter of American industrial history closes.